Welcome back to another episode of Integrate Yourself. We're your hosts, Allison Pelot and Maya Gottlieb. You're listening to episode 58. You can find me at pureenergypdx.com and you can find Maya at mayagottlieb.com. Maya and I are both certified nutrition and fitness coaches, and together we share over 20 years experience in the field, coaching clients and doing our own research on leading-edge nutrition and fitness in regard to hormonal balance and aging. This show is all about sharing with you creative ways you can integrate all aspects of health into your life and teaching you how to become your own authority when it comes to your health and wellness. Today I'm speaking with my dear friend Chris Ryan. I recorded this last month when he was visiting Portland. It was a very impromptu visit, as you'll hear in this episode, and I was very happy that we were able to record this conversation because it was amazing. So if you're not familiar with who Chris Ryan is, he is co-author of the book Sex at Dawn, How We Mate, Why We Stray, and What It Means for Modern Relationships. So he's transformed what we think of as relationships, what we think of as monogamy, and it really did bring up a lot of realizations and considerations for me in my life and in my relationship, and I'm going to share that with you today as well. Chris's research is focused on distinguishing the human from the cultural. He was first focusing on shamanism and ethnobotany, studying how various societies interact with altered states of consciousness and the sacred plants that provoke them. And later, by looking at diverse cultural perspectives on sexuality, and his doctoral dissertation was a multidisciplinary investigation of prehistoric human sexual behavior guided by the world-renowned psychologist Stanley Krippner. His podcast is called Tangentially Speaking. It's a weekly podcast, and he puts out news stories and inspiring conversations with very interesting people every week. He's also a frequent guest on the Joe Rogan Experience. As well, he's done a podcast with Joe Rogan and Duncan Trussell called The Shrimp Parade, so check that out. His latest book is called Civilized to Death. It explores the ways in which progress has perverted the way we live. He's also recently released a book called Tangentially Reading. It's a book of transcripts from his most memorable episodes and inspiring guests. Don't forget to support our podcast by subscribing on your podcast app and on our YouTube channel, as well as leaving us a great review on iTunes. We appreciate it so much. If you want to support us on Patreon and get great rewards, you can check us out at patreon.com/integrateyourself. Without further ado, here's the show. So welcome everybody to Integrate Yourself. I'm your host, Allison Pelot. Maya's not here with us today, but today I'm here with a very special guest. He's a good friend of mine. His name is Chris Ryan. And if you haven't heard of Chris Ryan, he actually is author of, I got the book right here, Sex at Dawn. And this is something I kind of wanted to talk about today because I feel like it was a huge turning point for me in my midlife crisis, that book was. And it also had a huge impact on Liam, who's my husband, and as you know. And just, you know, it kind of changed my purpose in my relationship and how I looked at it from then on out. And, you know, I just want to show some gratitude for you for writing that book. And of course, you know, thanks. The friendship has been amazing. I'm so glad we were able to become friends and be able to spend time together while you were here in Portland.
Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you for coming on.
Yeah. Well, I owed you one because you and Liam were on my podcast, and it was one of the most sort of touching and just moving episodes I have of 300 and some. That's one that people often are really touched by. It was great. And you guys shared some beautiful stuff there.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
I don't remember what episode it was, but it's in the archives.
Yeah, I'll put it in the show notes. Yeah, that was a lot of fun. And it was nice to also, that was really healing for me as well, to be able to talk about that, because I think for years I had, that story really brought me to tears for a long time. And it took a while to not be able to to be able to tell it without crying about it, and so that was really special too. So thank you, guys. Thank you for having us on your show too.
Yeah.
But I think, it's, you've been out there a lot. I'm sure a lot of people who are listening to this show and watching it know who you are. If not, definitely check out his podcast, Tangentially Speaking. It's a wonderful podcast. You talk to some really, really amazing people. A lot of people who have really amazing stories and very unique stories about life. And I just enjoy, especially listening to the stories of the people you have on your show, like when I'm driving or when I'm taking a road trip. It's just really nice because I feel like your interviews connect you to the people that you're talking to. It's very heart-centered and very connected, and I really appreciate that because those are the kind of podcast I really like to listen to personally, and it also has been a great inspiration for the podcast that I have as well, and for how I wanted to shape it and what I wanted to share with people. So, what inspired you to actually start the whole podcast and after you wrote the book and all that?
Yeah, I didn't really know what podcasts were. So this is 2011, 12. So it's early days still, And a guy named Duncan Trussell wrote to me, and he had read Sex at Dawn, and he wrote and said, hey, I'm a comedian in LA and I'd love to have you on my podcast. I read your book and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, well, okay, I'm doing lots of media for the book. I don't know what a podcast is, but I guess it's like radio or something. And I just really wanted to meet a comedian because I'd never met a professional comedian and sort of hung out. And I admire comedians, and truth tellers and all that. And so I went to the address. I thought it was a studio. It turned out to be his apartment. And he had a couple of mics set up on a little table in front of the sofa. And I walked in and he's like, hey, you wanna smoke a joint? You want a piece of mushroom? He offered me all this stuff.
That's funny.
And it was obviously like a very casual, relaxed situation. And we just sat there and talked for an hour or two, and then we went out and had a beer. And it was like, man, that was like the best interview ever because it wasn't a 7-minute radio thing. It wasn't like, okay, elevator pitch. What's your book about in 2 minutes?
Right.
We could really get into stuff. And then after we went out for a beer, as I said, and he said to me, like, dude, you should do a podcast, like you meet all these interesting people and your life has been, you've traveled and you've done this. And cause at that point we sort of knew each other. Right. And I thought, man, the last thing I need is another something to worry about, something to take up my time. But he was like, no, I have a friend. He'll like tell you what to buy, and it's really not a big problem. It's easy once you learn, the recording thing. And anyway, I thought, well, maybe I'll try it. We'll see. And luckily, I'm really fortunate because Duncan and Joe Rogan, and so I sort of plugged into this network in LA of people who have podcasts that were really big.
Right.
And so my audience ramped up pretty fast. And then it became, when 20,000 people are downloading it, it's like, wow, that's like a small stadium. That's
absolutely
amazing,
amazing.
And then you're getting all the emails from people like, oh, I love that conversation. And, and then the people come on are like, oh my God, I'm getting all this support from people. And so you sort of, like, I found myself in the center of this growing community.
Yeah.
And then it took on a life of its own, and I love it. It's, it's my favorite thing in my life right now, probably.
That's amazing. And it seems like, from what I know about you, Chris, like you really have a knack for connecting people and also just really attracting that certain kind of abundance in your life. And, some people attract like a lot of money. Some people attract a different kind of abundance, which is what I see you. And you kind of just go along and what you need comes to you. And it's kind of amazing. It's almost magical in a way. So that's what I've noticed.
I'm a lucky fucker is what you're saying. And I kind of think I am. I agree with you. Like my life, my life story, but like until I wrote Sex at Dawn and it became this surprise bestseller, and I was in my early to mid 40s, I guess, at that point. So until then, I was living hand to mouth, off the grid. Well, not off the grid, but off the under the radar. Like just traveling around the world and teach a little, translate a little, do this and that. And so the only thing that I ever had to give to people was my friends. And I was traveling a lot, so a lot of people were helping me. A lot of people were, I'd move to a new city and people would be like, oh, let me introduce you and let me show you around and all. And so when I left, what did I have to give them, right? I didn't have any money. I didn't have possessions. It was like, okay, before I leave, I want you to meet them, or I'd have parties where it'd be like the tattoo artist and the sex worker and the guy who's growing weed and the head of surgery at the hospital. And it's the only way they would ever meet each other was through me. And so that became like, I love that. It's, it's what can you give someone that's better than a friend, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, it kind of, you're right. That's kind of what I'm trying to do in the podcast is like, I get a chance to meet these amazing people. Let me introduce them to you,
Yeah, and that is a gift to everyone you meet too, because I know you did that with us. We had that party before you left, and we met a lot of people that we're still connected with, actually.
Yeah, that's great.
And it's just, I think that's a lot of things that that's one thing that people don't consider in life is like, that is really important. It's an important resource to have a community, to stay connected with people, and we forget that in the age of being online all the time and all that. But and that's something we're probably losing a little bit, and that's probably why my guess is to why people are really really love podcasts, is because they can kind of stay connected in that way. If they don't have a community they can really connect with, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, the most gratifying, there's so many gratifying things about it, but when someone writes and says, and this happens all the time, I thought I was really weird because there's no one in my town who thinks the way I do, then I hear you and Joe and Duncan and it's like, oh, right, you're like me, like and it is a community that, we don't know each other personally necessarily, but there is this sense of like, oh, there are people who laugh at the same shit I find funny, just not in my town, in this little Christian, or Mormon town in Utah, like, oh, they don't have the same kind of sensibility. Yeah. But I think it's really valuable for especially young people to, it's like being gay and there's no one gay in your town. Like, you think you're a freak, and then you go to San Francisco and you're like, oh, wait, there's a whole world of people like me.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a great segue into kind of what my personal journey was, where Liam and I, in our relationship, we've been married, like we're coming up on our 22nd year of being married, and we've been together probably longer than that. But, I guess where I'm going with this is that, like you said, you don't really know that other people are going through it, or you just assume that they're not until you really hear people talk about it. And I think that's part of meeting you and reading your book was what helped me heal from my midlife crisis, which was like basically just coming to terms with being with someone for so long, not really knowing, because we were together when we were kids, not really knowing if we were really wanting to be together anymore, and really having to explore that, and really based on our values and how they've changed, and never really dating other people before and not knowing what that was like, and so getting curious about that and exploring that, but also on the same side of that, really scared in the beginning, because that whole process is a little shameful, right? Because you're worried about, this is what I went through, thinking about like what people will think of you. Are you being taken, your husband's being taken advantage of you? We explored all this stuff, and we came back around to wanting to be monogamous, and that's kind of where we are now. But it was great to explore all of that without giving too many personal things away, just, really more of an inner exploration for ourselves and getting to know ourselves better and really coming back to what we really valued in that moment, in that time.
Yeah.
And that's what helped heal me, and that you were part of that. So I think just talking about it, bringing to light that, monogamy might not be for everybody, and we're all attracted to other people. That's a natural thing. It's not like you hit a certain age and you're not supposed to be attracted to anybody ever again.
Yeah.
So that I thought was really profound, and it was something that I hadn't learned. It wasn't something that I really thought was, a common. I know a lot of people got divorced. I've gotten divorced, but it wasn't something that I thought a lot of people were thinking about, until I heard it.
Yeah.
So,
Well, it's so great that you guys were able to sort of work through those issues together, and because you're right, people who get together when they're very young, they don't know how compatible they are.
Exactly.
And
it's so true.
Maybe they are super compatible, but they don't know it. And so to be able, 20 years into it, to be able to sort of, I think of like the hero's journey, Joseph Campbell, where you go out looking for something and then you go home and it's like, oh, that it was there all the time, but I wasn't able to see it until I left and had these experiences and then come back and now I recognize it.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's fantastic. If you are able to do that together with someone, that's incredible.
Yeah, and I think we all go through some kind of midlife crisis, whether it's in a relationship or whether it's like defining a new purpose in life, or changing a career.
Do I really want to be a mother?
Yeah, exactly.
Because I had my first kid before I could even think about things like that.
Exactly.
Do I really want this job? Like I picked it, I fell into it. I didn't really even choose it. Yeah. It's not just relationships. It's everything in life. Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? How like we expect people in their early 20s to make these lifelong decisions.
I know.
It's crazy.
It is really crazy. It's a lot of pressure, and the other thing is you don't really know yourself at that age. I mean, I didn't, and I think most people don't. But and this is what our show I know we talked a little bit about you when you were talking about, when I asked you to come on today, you were like, I don't really know anything about health and wellness, and I was like, well, health and wellness is everything. It's not just about working out. It's not just about nutrition. It's about your relationship with yourself, with other people, how you connect with that. And so, I think also it's really about being honest with yourself about where you are in life and how well you know yourself. And then the other part of our show is like in midlife, helping people integrate all the stuff you've learned from your 20s on, because that's about the time where we're realizing our bodies are changing, or a relationship is changing, or our purpose is changing, and then we need to integrate to make a change in those areas. So I think that's a huge part of health is really knowing your inner self.
Yeah and also relating to what we were speaking about earlier. I've been doing a lot of research for this book I'm just finishing about health. And as I'm sure you know, the thing that correlates most closely with life satisfaction is whether or not you feel that you're part of a community that's supportive and loving.
Yes.
And there are more people living alone now in the United States than ever before. We're going the wrong direction with that.
I agree.
Yeah. I had a guy, Johan Hari, on my podcast who wrote a book recently called Lost Connections. It's about the epidemic of depression and suicide and anxiety. And he shows the research demonstrating that it's very much related to the sort of collapse of community in the Western world. Yeah.
I believe that. Yeah. I mean, you can see it happening with just the more people are staying inside and kind of keeping the world between those four walls, and not really even getting outside and even connecting with nature, much less other people.
Right.
It's becoming a big problem. And I think as we go, we're just going to have to keep helping people connect, in that way.
Yeah. Kids growing up with the screens, they're depression rates are off the charts, and this. Yeah, I don't want to be a grumpy old man, but
well,
the book I just finished is called Civilized to Death, so you get a sense of where I am on civilization.
Right. Well, can we talk a little bit about that? Because
Sure.
I know you've been working on it for a long time. You're still working on it.
Time.
But I really like the idea of it and the whole concept behind it from what
Yeah.
you've talked about with it. And what is what direction? It sounds like the direction you're going in with it is that we're slowly killing ourselves by being too civilized, right? Or taking these practices of civilization into, what we're doing every day and not connecting with nature anymore and that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's essentially arguing that what we've been told about prehistory is negative propaganda, that prehistory was horrible. I call it the neo-Hobbesian narrative, right? That it was man was a wolf to man, and it was life before the state was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Everyone's heard that, nasty, brutish, and short.
Right.
It wasn't.
Yeah.
It wasn't solitary. The sense of community was much greater in hunter-gatherers than it was after agriculture. It wasn't poor. There was no poverty. The idea that people were running around constantly on the brink of starvation, struggling for survival, this is all bullshit. None of this stands up to scientific scrutiny. And similarly, what we've been told about the benefits of civilization is imbalanced and partial and more propaganda than scientific narrative. So the whole idea of civilization is that it's this incredible boon to humanity. It's this great gift. It's this crowning accomplishment of our species. But if you look at the actual life satisfaction of individual human beings, we don't have it better. Even the richest among us don't necessarily have it better than the typical hunter-gatherer did 20,000 years ago. Now, people listening to this are going to scoff. They're going to say that's ridiculous. That's Rousseauian romanticism and da-da-da-da-da. And I understand that. But I believe that's because we've been so deeply indoctrinated into this civilizational propaganda that it's hard for us to even entertain the idea, to even consider the notion that maybe this isn't really such a great thing for human beings.
Yeah, I can definitely see that point. And yeah, I think you're right. There's a lot of indoctrination going on there, that a lot of history that isn't being told really the right way, and stories that we're told that are not necessarily true. And I think that it's a good point to be made that people who are extremely wealthy are still not happy. I work with a lot of people that are some clients of mine that I've worked with and in the past have, they're very wealthy, but they're not. There's a lot of things that are going on there that they're still struggling with, just like people who don't have as much money.
Yeah.
So, okay. So, I think people who, we're finding it more and more that people who are more wealthy are still having the same issues that people are having that are not as wealthy. And I think I heard about a study said something about over $75,000, right? It doesn't matter after that point. You're not going to actually raise your happiness level after that point of money. So
yeah, that study was done by the guy who wrote Fast and Slow Thinking. He's a Nobel laureate economist, Hahnemann, I think his name is. Yeah, he found that above around 75 grand a year, there's no correlation between happiness and income. And, I looked into this issue quite a bit for Civilized to Death, and, was looking at like Silicon Valley and how there are people with, a net worth of $20 million who are still working 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, because the guy down the street is worth $30 million. Oh,
wow.
I mean, I got into this way, really looking at the data, and you're right. There's no correlation above like income where you got enough to eat, your kids can go to the doctor, you got a house, you know, got a place to live.
Right.
Above, once you get the basics worked out, there's often a negative correlation, actually, you know, because when people become quite wealthy, then you start to wonder if your friends really like you. You know, everything becomes very complicated, and you end up having higher levels of depression and anxiety and lower sense of community, you know, because it's like, well, why are we hanging out? Because we all go to the same golf club, you know, but do we like each other? Yeah, maybe not. And you actually find the highest levels of life satisfaction are in relatively poor, highly religious countries.
Really?
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah, and I don't think it's because of the religion per se. I think it's because religion provides a nucleus for community. You know, it's like the sand in the oyster that forms the pearl around it, right?
Yeah.
We all get together every week in the same place, the same people. It doesn't really matter if you're getting together to play poker or basketball or praise the Lord. The fact is you're all getting together, and then when one of you gets sick, the other ones, you know, care, and they know, and they take care of you. That's what's important. I don't think it matters what it is that you're doing every week. It's just that you do it, you know?
Yeah, that makes sense. I think as well, and you know, it's also a spiritual aspect of it is, you know, people want to feel that connection. They do want to feel like someone cares, basically, because, you know.
Because we're all vulnerable.
Yeah.
And the thing, you know, in Sex at Dawn and also Civilized to Death, one of the main arguments is that what makes us human is each other. It's community. You know, we're not meant to raise kids as a couple, much less as an individual woman.
Right.
So
no, it's very hard to do that.
It's impossible. Well, it's not impossible, but it's very, very hard. And it's impossible to do it without being stressed out of your fucking mind. Let's say that.
Yeah.
And it's not your fault.
Right.
You know, it's not your fault because you're not evolved to do that. Our human animal is evolved to live in small, highly interdependent groups, you know, hunter-gatherer bands where, you know, if a kid's crying, the adult closest to that kid picks him up. Nobody's like, hey, your kid's crying, you know, come deal with your kid. It's not how it works.
Right.
And so we evolved to live in those contexts. And here we find ourselves in a very different context. And getting back to your earlier point, it's my big insight in working on Civilized to Death was that it's not the 1% that's exploiting the rest of us. Because, as you say, if you look at the data, they're no happier than anyone else, and in some cases, less happy. And so I started thinking, like, what is going on then? Who's winning? Right? What kind of game is this where everyone's losing, including the winners?
Yeah.
And that led me to an idea which I may develop into a third book.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. Which sounds crazy, but I mean, if it doesn't sound crazy, it's not worth writing, I think.
That's true. I agree with that.
You know, in comedy, they say the best way to hold an audience is to fall in a hole and then climb your way out of it.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah. And that's kind of my natural, like, intellectual approach, is to say something like totally ridiculous and crazy at the beginning of the book. And then by the end of the book, hopefully you'll be going, oh, that kind of makes a little sense, actually, you know?
Yeah, it gets people's attention, right? Which is half the battle.
And it's conversational, right? Because like with Sex at Dawn, so much of the success of that book is that people would go to a dinner party and say, you know what? I just read this book that said, and people are like, that's ridiculous. And then you're off to the races, you know?
Right. And that's what I liked about it, because I think it was a conversation starter, and it creates a dialogue with people to start talking about it. It's not necessarily telling people how they should live their lives or what's right, the right way or the wrong way. It's more about, let's start talking about this, because this is a thing that's real and we're not talking about it. That's the problem, right? Yeah.
Yeah, there's no advice in that book.
No.
my publisher wanted a section of like, okay, here's how to do this or that.
Right.
And I wouldn't do it. Cassie and I were like, no, we're not giving advice. And I'm really glad we stuck to our guns on that because we don't know. Who knows? I use this line a lot, like in my TED Talk and elsewhere, where monogamy is like vegetarianism, right? It can be a really good choice. It can be healthy and ethical and blah, 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 blah. But just because you've decided to be a vegetarian doesn't mean bacon stops smelling good or that you're an herbivore.
It's true.
You're never going to be an herbivore, right? You're going to be an omnivore who chooses not to eat meat. Fine.
Right.
But that's different from expecting to become a deer,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, and the other part of it is, if you look at, if you want to compare it to vegetarianism or something, it's something that works for some people and something that might not work for you, but that's what you have to determine is how it works for you, but also if it's going to work, but how if it's not going to work, how are you going to create something different? And it doesn't have to be, there's no rule book for how to create that. It's kind of like what I had learned through that process is that you do it based on your values and what you're comfortable with. And so, you go from there, but there's certainly, I looked for it. I was like, how do people do this? How do people actually have a really successful polyamorous relationship? I feel like it would be really hard, and I searched and searched, but what I found was that like a lot of people do it differently and based on how they want to do it, Right. And
and there's, even like you're making the point, sort of like, let's say a horizontal point, like everyone approaches these things differently, which is absolutely true. But there's also a vertical axis where at different times in your life you may approach it differently.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's very
true.
With
diet,
when you have
like
kids,
you were saying.
I think when you have a young baby, it might not be a great thing to do.
Exactly. Yeah. Or a crisis at work, or your mother just died, or like, hey, you know what? I'm out. I don't want to deal with other people right now. I don't want to question. I want my home base to be absolutely solid and not to have to think about anything and anyone else for a while. People go through different phases. It's like what you were saying about exercise. You get to a point in your life where you're like, okay, now I'm not going to work out the way I did 20 years ago. Exactly. I'll hurt myself now, you know. Your body needs different things and your spirit. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So giving advice is hard. Cassie and I are thinking about a book, sort of a health book, health-ish, she's an MD, so she has much more qualification to talk about these things than I do. But even that book is going to be sort of an anti-advice book. It'll be a self-help book that's a parody of self-help books.
I think it's really wise though to do it that way because, and that's what I've thought about doing too. I'm also writing a book. I'm not a writer. I don't consider myself a writer, but I guess I'm now. But what I've noticed is as I practice it, as I just do a little bit, I think for me, just doing a little bit each day has helped. I have learned a lot more about myself and, and realizing that I don't want to be an authority for other people. I want them to become their own authority. And so I think going about it with that approach is really helpful for people to empower themselves because you don't want to become a guru or something like that, of course, that people are just waiting for you to tell them what to do. And I think that might have been a mistake that has been done in the past over and over again. And, for me personally, I want to avoid doing that. I want to build a community as well and, have people who are empowered by that. So, I think that's a very smart way to do it.
The problem is there's a massive market of people who want to be told what to do.
I know that is the problem. That's the whole marketing thing, right? And that's something I keep trying to get around, I guess, in a way, right?
People want answers.
Yeah, they do.
And it's frustrating when you tell them it depends. And that's the only answer that makes any sense.
Yeah.
But it's not satisfying.
No, it's not.
Because what you're saying is, I can't do the work for you. You need to do the work yourself. And nobody wants to hear that.
I know. So there are people that will do the work for you. But yeah, eventually, though, I think what will happen is you're going to come to the conclusion that you still have to do it yourself. So you can keep doing that for a while, but eventually you'll come back around to, oh, shit, I got to do this. I got to actually do it myself. I got to do the work, you know? So
someone said to me the other day, we were talking about this, and she said, there's no downhill path up the mountain.
That's good.
It's like, at some point you got to climb. You just got to do it.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
It's it is a big part of just growing up, I think, too.
Yeah. So you said you were having a midlife crisis.
Yeah,
I've been having a midlife crisis since I was like 21 or so.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, what did you have? I'm sure you went through one, but since you were 21, tell me more about that.
Well, I mean, if a midlife crisis is where you look at your life and say, oh my God, what am I doing? Do I really want to do this? Do I want to do that? And I think my whole fucking life has been a midlife crisis, but I don't see it as a crisis.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think for me, it was more of like, I was kind of doing what I was supposed to be doing in life, you know, getting married, having kids, getting a job,
right.
You know, I ended up starting my own business, which is a little different, but I think then when like kind of the rug was pulled out from under me, and, you know, there was some things that I don't want to give away too many personal things because Liam's not here to speak for himself, but, you know, we had a little bit of a crisis with our relationship. And so that really rocked my world because I never known him that way. I never had seen him in that light, and he had seen me in that light, and it was very different since we had been together for so long. But I think, yes, we're always going through some kind of crisis of self as we develop, as we change our values, as we want to do something different. Yeah. I think that's natural.
Yeah, really. And the difference between you and me is that you guys had made these lasting commitments when you were young.
Yeah.
And I had a moment. So I was in university and I was on track to go to grad school and, you know, like be an academic, and that was my thing. And I had I don't know if I've told you this story in other contexts, but I found a loophole where I could skip a year of college and graduate on time.
Oh.
And so I skipped my junior year and I hitchhiked to Alaska from New York. And I was like, at that point in my life, I was like, 19 or 20 or something. And, you know, I was smart. I was doing very well in school. I was going to go to Oxford. I was hanging out with my professors. You know, I was a pedantic little fuck. And I hitchhiked across America. I went on the ferry up to Alaska, and then I hitchhiked through Canada, the Yukon, and into Fairbanks. And I got busted in Fairbanks and went to prison for 4 days. Not jail, prison.
Wow.
Actual prison. Yeah. And then I, you know, worked in a cannery, and and then I hitchhiked back across Canada, and like it was this massive epic adventure, you know, for me at that age. And what happened was that I met all these people along the way who were people I never would have met at college, in this private, you know, liberal arts college, who were incredibly competent at living their lives. They didn't know who these philosophers and, you know, novelists were that I was interested in. They would have been sort of laughed at by my genius friends back at college. But I looked at their lives and it's like, wow, this dude picked me up on the highway, took me home, fed me, let me sleep in the living room. His wife is smoking hot and a really nice person, and they love each other. And he built that house himself, and he's got these dogs that are really cool, and he knows how to fix his car. And like, this guy, he knows how to live.
Right.
But he doesn't have a PhD, and he doesn't read fucking Nietzsche, and he doesn't. And then I look back at my professor friends who are fucking miserable, had, you know, don't know how to change a light bulb, have shitty, fucked up relationships with most of the people around them, are resentful and angry and unhealthy. And I'm 19 or 20 and I'm like, wait a minute, who do I want to be like here?
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
I mean, somewhere a mixture of the two.
Yeah.
You know, but like, I'm not laughing at this guy. This guy's cool.
Yeah.
And this guy's really kind to me and taking care of me. And in a way that if he stumbled into my world, nobody would take care of him.
Right. Yeah.
And so there was like this basic human decency that I was seeing. And that, I guess, was my midlife crisis, right? Because I was like, oh, that's what I've told everyone I'm going to do. I'm not so sure I want to do that.
Yeah.
But I didn't have kids and so it was easier.
Your definition of success changed at that moment, right? Yeah.
Like what kind of life do I want to have? I thought I knew, and now I'm not so sure. So I remember being in Alaska because then I went back the second year. I went back and graduated, and then I went back to Alaska. And I remember being in Alaska and saying, okay, I was maybe 20, and I was like, okay, I'm not going to make a commitment to anything or anyone until I'm 30. That's my plan. No grad school, no marriage, no career, nothing. From now, the next 10 years, I remember I'd read an essay by Robert Frost, the poet. It was an essay about writing. And he used this phrase, this beautiful phrase. He said, like a piece of ice on a hot stove, a poem must ride its own melting.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And I remember thinking, okay, I'm going to ride my own melting for the next 10 years. Yeah. Just wherever it takes me, I'm going to have adventures. I'm just going to float around the world and see what the fuck happens. And then I'll decide, So that's why, and it lasted more than 10 years.
Yeah.
Arguably, I'm still fucking floating and riding my melting.
But you have made some commitments along the way, right? I mean, but I think that as much as you can, right? But I think that it's really a great thing. I mean, not everybody obviously would be comfortable doing that, but I think that's really great to do in your 20s. I kind of wish I had done that because I think there is a time where you have to really get to know yourself because you just broke away from your parents, and their values. So what are your values now, right? I mean, you have to figure that out, but people don't actually do that. They don't make that transition or that rite of passage in their life to find themselves at that age. They just go right into something else. And I think that's the mistake that's being made over and over again. And then we get people who aren't really thinking for themselves. They're actually just reacting, right?
Yeah. And then they get to that age, somewhere in their lives where they go, what the fuck have I been doing?
Right. That's the midlife crisis.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's hard, like people make these I mean, you and Liam are really lucky. You're like my parents in that respect. My parents got together when they were really young, and turns out they really love each other.
Yeah.
But it's a roll of the dice because when you're getting together, you don't know if you really love each other. What you know is that you're attracted to each other, and in my parents' case, they didn't even know that they were sexually compatible because they were Catholic and they didn't have sex till they were married,
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So, but, here they are 58, 59 years later, they're still together.
Amazing.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, people who make these lifelong commitments, at least in theory, they're lifelong, and you have kids, in which case that is a lifelong commitment based upon, sexual attraction. That's like, it's like choosing your career based upon whether or not you like The Office. Yeah.
It's true. That's a good point. And even I remember like hearing a while back, I think it might have been on your show or somebody else's, but it might have been even Esther Perel talking about this too. Saying how if you're in birth control, like it'll change your pheromones and your attraction to another person. And then when you're off the birth control, which makes sense because most of the time it's estrogen, and that's going to affect your reasoning and emotional state. So then when people get off the birth control and have kids together, and you're like, wait a minute, why am I with this person?
Yeah. Well, that's, the pheromones are important because what the woman's picking up from the man is how compatible her immune system is with his.
Yeah.
And so there's this famous Klaus Wedekind did this the dirty T-shirt study,
Okay.
which we talk about in Sex at Dawn. And yeah, what he found was that women who were on birth control or on pills were not picking up that information about the man based on his smell. And so then when they go off the pill, they might find that the guy's totally repulsive.
Right. Yeah.
You know,
That's
even
kind of
though
crazy
he's still a cool guy,
Yeah.
right? I mean, you still have all these things in common, but
Yeah.
like she's just like, well, I don't want to sleep with this guy. I don't
Yeah.
even want to like smell his shirts, you know?
Yeah.
And it's not his fault. It's just an incompatibility that they weren't able to pick up because of that chemical interaction.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's rough.
Yeah, that is rough.
I was doing an interview once when Sex at Dawn first came out. It was some NPR local station. I won't even say the city. I don't want to cause any problems. But I told that story about the dirty T-shirt study, and the guy who was interviewing me, his face turned white, and he mouthed silently, "That happened to me."
Oh my God.
As I'm talking, he's like, "Oh my God!" And then at the end of the interview, he's like, "Dude, you just explained my first marriage. Oh
wow.
my God! Now I understand why she left me." And it was like, wow.
Wow, maybe that helped him.
I guess. I mean,
Jeez.
but that's rough, you
Yeah,
know?
that's really rough.
Like,
Yeah.
you love each other, you get married, you have a kid, and then she just can't wait to get away. And like,
Yeah.
wow,
God.
what did I do?
Yeah, and think about how many men are just devastated by that. That all of a sudden your wife just can't stand you for
Yeah.
no reason.
For no
Yeah,
reason
that
you can
know of.
understand, yeah. And, I mean, another effect, think about how many kids are
Oh yeah.
not as healthy as they could be because
Right.
the immune system of the parents was not compatible.
Yeah, that's something we don't really think about, and
Right.
we tend to, and Mai and I usually talk a lot about this on the show. Is like we, just from a health standpoint and hormonal standpoint, we are like really suppressing a lot of natural hormones that we should be producing in our bodies that will help us live a healthier life and make good decisions, you know, and not as much from like a brain fog or a total emotional state, but more from like a clear-headed kind of, and that for women is progesterone. So estrogen can really, really mess things up for women in that way, I think, if we're overdoing it with that. So, yeah. But we're going off topic a little. But I think that there's a lot of it actually that makes so much sense, and more people really should know about that before they get on birth control.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want people to misunderstand. Like sometimes people have written to me saying, "Oh, you know, I like the book except for your diatribe against the pill." And I'm not against the pill per se. All I'm saying is, you know, if you're on the pill and you meet somebody you like and you're thinking about long term, go off the pill for 6 months to a year before you sign any papers.
That's a good idea.
You know, just
Yeah.
to see.
Yeah, and it's very controversial. It's hard because, like, what are people's options with that? And yeah, that's a lot of people are like, well, what then do I do if I want to just not have a baby, you know, or get pregnant?
Well,
So
I don't know. Is it so complicated?
I don't think it is. I think we make it that way because the medical community teaches us that. But I think that, you know, I mean, we just use what we naturally have, which is progesterone. Like I said earlier, progestation. If your body thinks it's pregnant with that, and it's probably not going to get pregnant. But there's ways that you can use that, which we won't go into today. But, you know, they're better than estrogen, I think.
There are also lots of ways that you can have sex that don't result in pregnancy.
Yeah, that didn't work for us. But yes, you're right.
We'll talk about that off mic. I don't know.
Well, I think,
is this
yes.
a virgin birth situation?
Oh, I don't know. You know, we say that, but it is just, we just weren't, you know, we were very naive, I think. But there are definitely, I think, other ways. Yeah.
I'm making the host blush. That's
I know,
great.
you definitely are. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I spend so much time talking about sex that I've lost any sort of decent hesitancy to just launch into everything, and with the bonobos and porn stars on my podcast and everything. But I don't know. I mean, it seems to me that it shouldn't be that hard to avoid pregnancy. But
I know.
You know.
Well, I mean, we had to have figured out a way back in the day before we were a modern society, right?
Well, not necessarily. I mean, back in the day, women, if we're talking about the hunter-gatherer day, the main way that women avoided pregnancy was that they were breastfeeding.
Oh, right. Yeah. And
So
I
that's how
believe they didn't
spaced.
get pregnant they wouldn't let the women get pregnant 3 years after having a baby because they knew it really had a toll on the body and they were so depleted. The women wanted to be able to build back up.
Well, it's not so much that they wanted to, it's that they had very low body fat. And hunter-gatherers tend to have quite low body fat content. And so when a woman is breastfeeding, there's sort of a natural mechanism, lactational hemorrhagia, I think it's pronounced, where she stops ovulating. So she continues having sex,
Right.
but while she's breastfeeding, she won't conceive.
Yeah.
And so that was sort of a natural mechanism for spacing out births. And then also if there was a lack of food or, then that would also suppress the body fat, which suppresses the ovulation. So there are sort of natural ways that women's fertility is in alignment with environmental factors.
So you're saying you can either starve yourself or breastfeed. No, I'm just kidding.
Or
Yeah, and they would probably breastfeed for like 3 years as opposed to what
3-4
they do
years.
now.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and also the breastfeeding thing isn't as effective now because women's body fat content is higher. And,
Right.
So it doesn't trigger the same sort of, unless like women who are athletes, long distance runners,
Yeah.
women whose lifestyle creates the conditions that were more typical of hunter-gatherers, they tend to stop ovulating as well.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. Well.
So you better pick another line of conversation or I'm going to keep talking about ways to have sex without getting pregnant.
That's okay. We can talk about that. That's fine. Yeah, we don't talk about sex that much on the show, but I have wanted to have that conversation for a while because it is a part of health too. And again, if your sex drive is low, that's an indication that your health is in dire straits. I think, I think that's a really good indication right there. If you're not having that sex drive and, especially for women who also get to that maybe midlife point where they're not producing those sex hormones anymore and they just kind of hit a rut. And that could be another reason why, couples break up too.
Rut is a funny word there. They hit a rut or they don't hit a rut.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting. Menopause is a very interesting issue for human beings because most animals, the females, don't continue to survive beyond, much beyond their reproductive years.
Oh, right.
So it's quite unusual in mammals to have this extended period of time after you stop being reproductive.
Do you know if women were experiencing menopause as much as hunter-gatherers as they are now? Did your research bring you to any of that?
Sure. Yeah. Because, I sort of referred earlier to the neo-Hobbesian myth that hunter-gatherer life was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, right? A lot of people who scoff at the very idea of civilized to death believe things like they believe that 35 years was a typical lifespan of our ancestors, which is totally false. But almost everybody believes that. So they would say, well, of course there was no menopause because nobody lived past 35. Well, in fact, hunter-gatherers lived into their 70s and still do. And even into their early 80s in some cases. the sort of modal lifespan of hunter-gatherers is somewhere between 68 and 72 years of age, meaning that's the age span in which most people died who lived into adulthood. Now, the reason one of the reasons that there's a lot of confusion around this is that a lot of hunter-gatherer kids died before they're 3 or 4.
Right.
And so when you average them into it, then you get an average lifespan. So
the infant mortality rate too, right?
Infant mortality skews it, right? But that doesn't mean no Homo sapien was ever old at the age of 35. Right?
Yeah.
Physiologically.
Yeah.
So that's a great, a lot of confusion around that. So yes, hunter-gatherer women, our species has been experiencing menopause for forever, apparently. Even chimps and bonobos live well into their 50s.
Oh.
Yeah. So it's an enigma. It's something that evolutionary scientists have spent a lot of time thinking about and trying to figure out why it evolved, why it exists, if it's a byproduct of some other evolutionary thing. The leading hypothesis now is what they call the grandmother hypothesis, which is that having a living grandmother confers survival advantages to kids because you have someone else around, like a backup mom, and having these older women, even though they're not reproducing, they're still helpful to the kids who are being born and to the parents and all that. So it only makes sense when you understand that we evolved in these hunter-gatherer bands where people were very interdependent and not in isolated nuclear families,
Yeah, and everybody had a purpose in the community, and I think the older people actually provided a lot of wisdom for the younger people, right. And which doesn't happen as often now.
Right.
So that's a whole nother topic of pharmaceuticals, but I think hopefully that we can get more and more people as we get older to continue to pass that wisdom down to younger people, because I think they still really need that. And we also need their curiosity and their, passion for life. So we kind of all need each other in that process. Yeah. But, well, cool. Well, this has been a really great conversation, Chris. I don't know where to quite end it, but I really, it's been great to sit here and talk to you about this, because I think I've wanted to have this conversation with you for a while, and I'm glad that this is basically, this is kind of an impromptu thing, because I just knew you were going to be here yesterday. So.
I just knew I was going to be here yesterday.
Yeah.
I was camping with a buddy who's a fireman, and he got called up, and he's like, "Oh shit, I gotta go back to Portland right away." And so sort of found myself here unexpectedly. We had dinner last night, and like, okay, let's do a podcast tomorrow. It's funny, one of the things I like. It's a little awkward and weird when you're friends,
of course,
and it's like, oh wait, we're having a conversation, but there are these other people listening who we can't see, and but I've gotten used to that. I have some friends who I really only hang out with when we're doing a podcast.
Oh yeah,
like Joe Rogan.
Right.
He's a good bud, but like really 90% of the time we're together, we've got microphones in front of us.
Right.
But. What I love about it is that it gives you a chance to like actually just sit down and talk with someone.
Yeah.
Where like you and I have hung out a lot, but it's normally there are other people around, and there might be a snippet where we're just talking to each other, but most of the time, Liam's coming in and out and other people. And so it's good to have an excuse to just sort of turn off the phones and sit here and just focus on each other for a while.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Very special. Thank you, Chris.
My pleasure.
Yeah.
Literally.
So to tell you guys again how to find Chris. He has a podcast called Tangentially Speaking. You can find it everywhere. You can find him on Joe Rogan. I don't know how many interviews you've done on Joe Rogan, but a lot. And do you guys still do the shrimp parade?
Occasionally. We did one a couple of months ago. That's when Joe and Duncan and I get together. Yeah.
And of course, his book is Sex at Dawn. And you have another book that not just came out, but it's tangentially reading. Thank you.
Based on the podcast.
Yeah, which is really cool. That's a great idea.
Did you guys have a copy of that?
No, we didn't.
You will soon.
Did Murphy make it into that one or not? No,
no,
okay.
He's not in that one.
That's okay.
It's a continuing series though. Volume 2 is underway right now.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah. Yeah, that if he had, I was going to get him I was actually going to try to order the book, but I think it was like sold out or something. Yeah. So, but I was going to give it to him as a gift if he had made it in there. But I definitely would love to get a copy of that. But I think that's such a great idea to actually put everything, all the interviews that the very special interviews into the book, because I think that it's just a different way of looking at it instead of listening, and you can kind of reflect on it a little bit differently. And and
a lot of people don't even know what podcasts are.
Oh, right.
And so
that's true.
What I was thinking is people listen to podcasts and they're like, Dad, you should listen to this podcast. I'm like, fucking podcast. You give him the book and like, that's why, and then he can read it and be like, oh, I see. Because it's not really an interview. It's a conversation.
Of course. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's excerpts. And what I love about it, getting back to this notion of community that we were talking about earlier, basically I said, I'd like to do this book. And this guy, Matt Owen, who works at a small independent publishing house, was like, that's a great idea. I'd love to organize it. And then I said, okay, we're going to do this book. And people who listen to the podcast were like, I'd love to transcribe some episode. And, I'd love to do this one. And so people volunteered. And we left it up to them, like, okay, you pick episodes that you want and pick the section that you think is particularly interesting. And so it's really a community project. Mm-hmm. The art was all done by a guy who listens to Adam McDade, who listens to the podcast. And so the whole thing came together as this community barn raising kind of thing.
That's awesome. Yeah. See, that's a great example of the Chris Ryan magic that I was talking about in the beginning.
There it is. And I get all the money.
Yes. Well, you did all the work. You did a lot of the work.
No, I didn't do any work. No, we share the money, so it's cool. That's great. Everybody gets a piece.
I love that. Yeah. Well, thanks again, Chris, and hopefully we'll see you again soon and connect again.
All right. Yeah. Thanks, Allison.
Thanks. Bye. Thanks so much for listening today. If you want to check out the podcast notes from today, comment and share with your friends, you can go to pureenergy-pdx/integrate-yourself-podcast/Chris-Ryan. We'd love it if you'd share it with a friend, and feel free to comment and start a conversation. If you're interested in Maya and I's coaching services, you can check out Maya at mayagottlieb.com. You can definitely connect with me through pureenergypdx.com. What I do is I put everyone through a 6-week coaching process where I teach you how to use your own physiological feedback and tools to read that physiological feedback so that you can learn about how your body functions. And getting to know your body better is very empowering to getting to know what foods work best for you and the types of foods that are best for increasing your metabolism, increasing your thyroid function, and which increases your energy, increases your rate of recovery. As well, it helps with your disposition on life, your mood, and just how you look at life. So if that sounds like a road you'd like to go down, you can find me at pureenergypdx.com and contact me there. Thanks so much for listening, everybody. And until next time, we'll talk to you again soon.